Hello Internet, I'm Jackie Fox, and I was going to start this video with a part addressing what even is a recession, and are we in one? I even made a cool little animation for it, but I've decided that this video that I'm putting on screen, there will be a link in the description for it, actually does a better job of that. She gets a bit in the weeds on a lot of topics in kind of a good way. It can be a little confusing though. But ultimately, I don't think it's worth my time to break down a lot of it, except to say that overall, what defines a recession is a lot more nuanced than our typical understanding, and that our economy right now is fractured and broken into a lot of different groups that are all experiencing the same economy in different ways. And that, you know, perhaps some industries actually are going through a recession, like the tech industry right now, for example, or a lot of speculative investment like Bitcoin and NFTs, that sort of stuff is definitely going through something like a recession. But other larger parts of our economy, like the retail market and a lot of other areas, aren't necessarily seeing a recession. So it ends up being a really complicated question to answer to begin with. And ultimately, the answer is not yet, at the very least. So with all of that out of the way, I want to look at two bills that are moving through Congress at the moment. Because for one of the very rare moments on this channel, I'm actually getting an opportunity to say, wow. I laid out a bunch of problems, I laid out a bunch of solutions to those problems, and now I am actually seeing at least some of those solutions being pushed through Congress. And it's a weird moment for me. It's probably a weird moment for our country that our Congress is actually doing anything beneficial, meaningful, and not exactly timely, but at least needed at the time it's being done. But, you know, I think we should take a moment to celebrate that, because we've got two bills that really address some big problems. First, the microprocessor shortage, which is being dealt with through an incredibly large, in fact, I think it's one of the largest funding bills of its kind to come through Congress, and that is the CHIPS Act. And that does a lot in the way of giving a lot of government funding to starting these microprocessor fabs, which are incredibly expensive to get started. The entry cost is so massive, much like nuclear plants, that it is very difficult to get private industry, even if it is an incredibly profitable market that they will have very little competition in, to actually put the money down to get these started. And much in the way that we have built a lot of the nuclear plants that actually are in operation in this country, we had to pour a lot of money into getting those started before they were, you know, actually built and in operation. And as I pointed out when I was talking about nuclear policy in a previous video, I think it would be better if we just cut the private companies entirely out of this, or at least mostly out of this, or, you know, treated the government funding as an investment, use it to purchase a certain amount of the company, you know, get something in exchange, so it's not just like dumping a bucket of money on a fire, or in this case, on a new tech industry's head. I mean, Bernie Sanders has been kind of the canary in the coal mine about just how big this is, and how much money is directly going into these kind of tech startups.
A little over a week ago, the CEO of Intel, a gentleman named Pat Gelsinger, who earns something like $179 million a year in compensation, not a bad salary. Mr. Gelsinger did an interview on CNBC's Squawk Box program. And I think to listen to that interview tells us everything we need to know about oligarchy and arrogance and the state of American politics.
But my message to our congressional leaders is, hey, if I'm not done with the job, I don't get to go home. Neither should you. do not go home for August recess until you have passed the CHIPS Act, because I and others in the industry will make investment decisions. And do you want those investments in the US? Or are we simply not competitiveness to do them here? And we need to go to Europe or Asia for those. Get the job done. Do not go home for August recess without getting these bills passed.
In other words, what he is telling you point blank is who is the puppet and who is the puppeteer. Don't go home this August until you give us $176 billion, because if you don't do that, we're going to go to Asia and we're going to go to Europe. That's the state of American politics. The CEO of Intel is saying that if you don't give his industry a $76 billion blank check and his particular company up to $30 billion, that despite, no doubt, their profound love for America, I'm sure they got big American flags all over the place, and their patriotism, and their concern for the needs of the military and the healthcare industry, which in fact needs these sophisticated chips, that if we do not give them this bribe, despite their love of America and their concern about our national defense, you heard Senator Cornyn talking about national defense, and he's right. This is a national defense issue. But despite all of that and all of their love for America, they're willing to go to Asia and go to Europe. Madam President, as I said last week, I am thankfully not a lawyer, but that sure sounds like extortion to me.
He doesn't argue that we don't need this, but that instead this is a crisis that was basically manufactured by our own microchip manufacturing facilities, which laid off American workers, shipped their work overseas. And in addition, he goes on about how many of these companies, when they had received money from the government previously, even in the last decade, they had used that money, they had used billions of dollars. Intel in particular used a comparable amount of money on stock buybacks fairly recently to what they are being offered in this bill. And there's no guarantee in the bill that they won't do this again, which unfortunately means that they likely will do this again. And, you know, I kind of agree in that this shouldn't be a blank check, but I don't know. I'm not a congressperson. Bernie, if you want the non-blank check version of this, write it, propose it. This is what we've got. And I hope that it goes well, because we really need this. And it shouldn't just be my hopes. I do agree with Bernie on that for sure. But it feels like Bernie is holding a grudge against them and being punitive in a way that's not really helping us move on. And if this turns out to be a big mess, an 87 or a $78 billion mess, well, Bernie has all the right to say I told you so. But hopefully this works. Moving on to the next bill, though, we've got the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, there's a lot that I could criticize about this bill as well. A lot of it would be, mainly just the scope. It feels like this bill has been chipped away from something much larger purely because Joe Manchin exists. Like, this has been whittled down to the point that Joe Manchin can agree with it. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't still do a lot of good things that I really hope should pass, with maybe one of the exceptions being the amount of emphasis that it puts on electric vehicles, because I think really shifting away from personal vehicles being the standard of transportation, even if Americans still own personal vehicles into the future, we should have many more options for public transportation that will definitely decrease energy usage for transportation quite considerably in a way that even electric cars don't do, and therefore they will reduce our dependence, the dependence on fossil fuels to create the electricity for those vehicles. But let's get into a lot of the things that it does. Because it's not just a climate change bill, and I've heard people bill it that way, and that really, I feel like that describes about a third of the bill. Like its name, it says that it is an Inflation Reduction Act. So the first way that it addresses this, and possibly my favorite, is to tax the rich, which is pretty based. Economist at UCA, Kim Causing, noted that the core measures in the Inflation Reduction Act would result in $313 billion in revenue raised from a corporate minimum tax rate, $124 billion in revenue raised through better IRS enforcement, and $14 billion in revenue raised from closing the carried interest loophole. This is all expected to decrease inflation, especially in luxury markets, by reducing excess demand by the wealthy by more equitable taxation. But that's just the icing on the cake. The main thing that the Inflation Reduction Act does to achieve its named goal is increasing supply by attempting to use federal funds to solve supply chain bottlenecks through investment in domestic manufacturing, and especially the deployment of reliable clean energy that will bring down long-term energy costs, making our energy market in the US less vulnerable to global supply shocks like the ones that we face with the invasion of Ukraine that may repeat again in our future or, may not end anytime soon. And of course, all of this is more beneficial in the long term. In the short term, the legislation provides money for home energy rebates, consumer tax credits for energy efficient homes and vehicles, and grants to make affordable housing more energy efficient. It is estimated that these measures will help reduce energy costs for families by more than 10% on average. The bill also aims to decrease consumer expenses by empowering Medicaid to negotiate directly for drug prices, something that people have been pushing for, including Bernie, for quite some time now, and it caps the Medicare beneficiaries' out-of-pocket cost for drugs at $2,000 per year, while also extending the Affordable Care Act tax credit for 3 years. Unlike a lot of bills that I've seen, and I say, man, this would be really great if it passed, that would really fulfill some of the political objectives I've been advocating for years, I think this one actually has a good shot at passing because it's being billed as the only alternative to the Fed continuing to raise interest rates. For a lot of wealthy investors and lobbyists, it's like the Fed is twisting their arm and holding it behind their back so that they won't oppose legislation like this, giving us kind of a limited window of time to get some shit done that really needs to be done. And it does a number of things that are commendable. In fact, it does several of the things that I said that good inflation policy would do in my previous videos, and I feel like I have to give this a ton of credit where credit is due. But at the same time, I don't think that this is the end of what should be done, even to account for this single crisis. As companies, especially in the tech industry, that have been relying on investor capital and unlimited free money from the Fed, now having to pay interest rates, might cause some of those companies some serious pains, which, as history tells us, will lead to layoffs. And actually, in the tech industry at least, it already has led to layoffs, and that's, well, actually, it's kind of hard to say that this was directly because of the Fed, because the tech industry is even outside of that going through some shit right now. And an increasing number of Americans work in this industry, so how will we as a country support them in their time of need? One more time, I need to give a shout out to the idea of sending money to the states to reinforce their ability to pay unemployment claims, because this is likely to only get worse, at least in certain parts of the market, even with this legislation. And maybe the government being proactive is too much to expect, but someone forward-thinking needs to start drafting this legislation now. Again, looking at you, Bernie, you did a great job with this type of thing 2 years ago. So it's really time for you to fight like hell for us all over again. Another rising inflationary factor that affects many Americans is rising house and rental costs. And absolutely nothing about our situation indicates that these are coming down anytime soon. So it seems likely that the only way that Americans will get relief from these prices is through legislation. I think a commitment to building affordable housing instead of just greening it up nationwide would be a really big help here. And provided we don't get terribly out of hand with that, which I don't think there's any real risk of in such a capitalist country, this could provide a modest bump to that ailing GDP figure, simply because investing in construction and building a stronger country, literally, is a great way to build up a failing gross domestic product. And being part of the reason why China's gross domestic product has been so strong in the years leading up to their current housing crisis. Not necessarily saying that we should emulate any part of that disaster, but we could stand to prop up our GDP a little bit through the building of affordable housing for Americans. I'm not asking for American ghost cities here. I'm just asking that people aren't priced out of the least expensive homes in the places that they grew up. One final note about the IRA before I end this video. It is a really dense bill. A lot of parts of it get into the weeds on issues that really need someone to get into the weeds on. And this video would probably go on forever if I covered all of the ways that it does that. But one of my favorite that I do want to give a shout out to, just to indicate some of the deeper complexity of this bill, is the idea of moving the country more towards heat pumps as our way of heating and cooling, because it's pretty much the most efficient way that we can do that. And by standardizing that across the country, it's going to make our cities incredibly more energy efficient, and we should start doing that now, especially in relation to heating and cooling, as our country is habitually heating up. So I really think that there is a lot of good stuff here. And again, mainly my complaints come with scope. But it makes sense to me to complain about that in particular, because I'm not really opposed to anything that's particularly in this bill after it passes. So I'll make this promise to you. If this bill passes and becomes law, then we can talk about all the reasons that it's insufficient to deal with all of the problems that it seeks to deal with. But for right now, I think it's just enough to say, I hope that it makes it. So to make clear my position on whether or not the IRA is actually going to fight inflation in the short term, well, I think it makes some strides toward fighting inflation in the long term, and I think those absolutely need to be made. But it does forgo a lot of measures that would directly deal with a lot of the short-term causes of inflation. And building out a lot of these solutions in any case is going to take time. So other than things like price controls, there's not a lot that you can do in the short term. And I think that what the administration is hoping for here is that the savings to your energy costs will be significant enough to offset at least a good amount of the inflation that you may see piling up before these things begin to really calm the markets. Thank you so much for tuning in to my rants about economics and politics and all of these things that are frankly a little bit boring. I really appreciate you sticking around and taking the time to care about the world around you in such a way, and I would really appreciate it if you could like, subscribe, or check out the links on screen. Send me some money if you can to help support me doing more shows like this and being able to take more time, effort, and maybe even a little bit of budget in making these videos. But even if you don't, I'm going to keep making them. It's been a little difficult doing this, trying to grow this without advertising, and you supporting me on Patreon or Ko-fi makes that decision easier for me. But even if you don't, again, I don't think I'm going to change anything that I'm doing. I'm not threatening to add ads to these videos. I'm just saying I would appreciate $1 or $2 if you can spare it. And if you can't, well, I'll see you here for the next video. It's always free to hit like and subscribe. Thank you for tuning in.